very, very early on the Wednesday morning between the death and the funeral. And I just sat down and wrote it, and it took about an hour and a half.
It wasn't just a funeral, it was a reckoning. On September 6, 1997, the world stood still, not in honor of a monarch, a politician, or a leader of nations, but for a woman who made royalty feel human. Princess Diana's death tore through the global consciousness like a scream in the dark, and her funeral became more than a farewell. It became a collective moment of grief, a silent revolt against the institutions that had failed her. Over 2 billion people watched the ceremony unfold, some in tears, others in disbelief, but all united in a single truth. This was not how her story was supposed to end. The streets of London were blanketed in sorrow. Mourners poured into the city by the thousands. They clutched flowers, photos, handwritten notes, each one a desperate attempt to say goodbye to someone they had never met, yet felt they intimately knew. The sea of tributes outside Kensington Palace overflowed into the roads, swallowing sidewalks and stopping traffic. You could hear the sobs. You could feel the weight of loss settle over the city like a suffocating fog. It was as if the entire world had exhaled at once and then forgotten how to breathe again. But nothing struck deeper than the sight of 2 young boys, one 15, the other just 12, walking behind their mother's coffin. Prince William and Prince Harry, faces pale, eyes downcast. They marched in silence, each step a brutal reminder of what they had lost. Most believed the boys had chosen to do this, that somehow they had volunteered for this unthinkable role in the world's grieving. Theater. But that wasn't the truth. It would take years before the public learned what really happened behind the palace doors because someone tried to stop it. Diana's younger brother, Charles Spencer, stood firmly against the idea. The moment he was informed of the plan to parade, his grieving nephews through a sea of photographers and onlookers, his heart sank. To him, it wasn't a tribute. It was cruelty, a spectacle disguised as tradition. Diana had spent her life shielding her boys from the press, and now, in death, the institution she had tried to escape was about to expose them in the most invasive way imaginable. Spencer protested. He argued. He pleaded. But no one listened. The palace insisted. The B-boys had consented. That they understood. But Prince Harry would later admit he didn't have a choice. At 12, he was simply told what to do. And like any boy raised in the shadows of duty and silence, he obeyed. As the funeral procession began, the cameras rolled. Every step was captured. Every twitch of the boys' faces analyzed. Behind the scenes, Charles Spencer walked with them, physically close, emotionally boiling. His grief wasn't just for his sister. It was for the betrayal playing out in real time. The betrayal of 2 boys forced to perform their pain for a nation. Spencer's resistance that day was only the beginning. Because this wasn't just about mourning. It wasn't just about tradition. This was about power, about control, and about one man who saw through the silence and decided he would never, ever be quiet again. But the tension brewing behind the palace gates wasn't just about grief. It was about control, silence, and a brother who refused to look the other way. They said the princes agreed, that they were willing, that this, somehow, was part of their healing. But Charles Spencer knew the truth, and what he witnessed that day would haunt him for the rest of his life. The palace told the public that William and Harry had made the decision themselves, that they chose to walk behind their mother's coffin, shoulder to shoulder with their father, grandfather, and uncle. But behind closed doors, it wasn't choice that shaped that moment. It was obedience. Orders delivered to children too young to say no, and the man who tried to protect them, Diana's own brother, was silenced in real time. Prince Harry would later reveal what he truly felt that day. He hadn't volunteered. He hadn't raised his hand or voiced some noble wish to walk those cruel steps. He was told what to do. He was 12. And in the royal world, 12 means you follow protocol, not your heart. The walk wasn't healing, it was harrowing. Harry said it felt like he wasn't even there, like he was outside himself, watching a scene he didn't understand, surrounded by cameras, stares, and a grief too big to carry. And still, he walked. Because that's what they told him to do. Charles Spencer had fought to stop it. From the Iggy moment, the plan was proposed, he felt a cold rage burn through him. He had watched Diana battle for years to protect her sons from the media's gaze. She had refused to let them be paraded like showpieces. She had gone to war with the press, drawn clear lines, and demanded that her children be treated as humans, not heirs. Spencer remembered that. He knew his sister, and he knew with every fiber of his being that she would never have agreed to this. Yet the palace pushed forward. They dismissed his concerns. They told him the boys were on board, that it was settled. But Spencer didn't buy it, not then, and certainly not now. The walk, in his eyes, was a betrayal not just of Diana, but of the very protection she had died trying to offer. To him, it was a public execution of privacy, a punishment disguised as pageantry. And all he could do was walk beside them, feeling powerless, furious, and hollow. He watched William and Harry, so young, so silent, step through the thick weight of mourning, while the world watched like spectators at a cruel drama. Their faces were frozen. Their bodies moved, but they looked like ghosts, not boys. Spencer could barely keep pace, not because of the speed, but because every step felt like it was cracking something inside of him. Diana was gone. Her sons were being forced to grieve on display, and the very institution that claimed to love her had done nothing to stop it. It was in that moment, perhaps, that Spencer's understanding of the royal machine fully changed. This wasn't just about tradition or ceremony. It was about power, about image. Diana in life had been a challenge to that image, and in death, they controlled the narrative. They orchestrated how the world would remember her, and in doing so, they discarded her most sacred wishes. Spencer didn't speak of it publicly right away, but something shifted in him. That day became a fracture point, not only in the royal family's story, but in his own. He would not forget. He would not forgive, because what he saw wasn't just grief, it was exploitation, and it cemented a terrifying truth in his mind. Diana hadn't been protected in life, and now, even in death, she was being silenced by spectacle. But what broke Spencer wasn't just the parade of grief, it was the call he got before the world even knew Diana was gone. Thousands of miles away, deep in the stillness of a South African night, Charles Spencer was sleeping soundly. There was no warning, no sense of the storm coming, just the sharp ring of a phone cutting through the dark. He picked it up, still groggy, expecting nothing more than a routine call. But the voice on the other end wasn't calm. It was trembling, hesitant. All it said was that Diana had been in a car crash. There were no details, no comfort, just a vague, chilling statement and a pause that said more than the words ever could. Spencer sat up, his heart pounding, a cold wave rushing over him. Something was wrong, very wrong. That first call left him suspended in dread. He didn't know where she was, how serious it was, or who was with her. All he knew was that his sister, Diana, the woman he had grown up with, fought for, loved fiercely, was in trouble. And somewhere, deep in his gut, he felt a familiar dread rising. The press. They had been stalking her for years, chasing her like prey. Spencer had long feared it would come to this, but nothing prepared him for the second call. When the phone rang again, he picked it up with shaking hands. This time, the voice didn't hesitate. Diana was gone. For a moment, time stopped. Spencer couldn't move, couldn't think. The words didn't make sense. He had always imagined that Diana, with all her strength, would somehow survive anything. But not this. Not in a tunnel, not in a car, not like that. The pain hit like a wrecking ball, but beneath the sorrow, rage began to simmer. Because he knew who was responsible. To him, this wasn't just a tragic accident. It was the end result of years of cruelty, years of cameras flashing in her face, headlines twisting her truth, and an institution that never lifted a finger to protect her. He didn't need to see the crash photos. He didn't need to hear the reports. In his mind, he could already picture it, the car speeding through the streets of Paris, chased by photographers hungry for their next payday. The same press that hounded her in life now delivered her to death. Spencer's grief instantly transformed into something else, something sharper. He wasn't going to sit in silence. He wasn't going to let this be spun into another palace-approved fairy tale. He would speak. He would remember. And he would never forgive those who pushed Diana to the edge and then turned their backs. The loss was unbearable. But what stung even more was the pattern, the same failure, over and over again. No protection, no shield, just silence from the very people who should have done everything to keep her safe. And as Spencer sat in the dark, oceans away from the chaos unfolding in Paris, one thing became clear. The world had just lost its brightest light, and he had just lost his sister. But this time, he wouldn't let that silence win. As the sun rose, the world mourned, but inside palace walls, something felt disturbingly silent. While the world cried, the royal gates stayed shut. No flag was lowered, no statement released. Not a single royal voice emerged to comfort the grieving millions. Outside Buckingham Palace, the ground disappeared beneath a mountain of flowers, handwritten notes, teddy bears, and photographs of Diana. Strangers hugged one another as if bound by invisible threads of sorrow. They stood for hours, silent or sobbing, united in one thing: heartbreak. And yet, as this tidal wave of grief swept through the nation, the institution that had once called Diana one of their own remained frozen, cold, quiet, unmoved. For 5 long days, Queen Elizabeth stayed at Balmoral with Prince Charles, William, and Harry. 5 days of unbearable silence. No address, no public appearance, no visible gesture of empathy. The same monarchy that had paraded Diana in front of the cameras for years now vanished from sight the moment she was gone. It was a silence that quickly turned from puzzling to infuriating. Newspapers began printing the questions people were already whispering in the streets. Where is the Queen? Why hasn't the flag been lowered? Do they even care? Headlines grew bolder. Editorials stopped holding back. The press, usually deferential to the crown, became a mirror, reflecting back the anger of the people. Because this wasn't just about protocol, it was about presence. Diana had made the world feel seen. She held the hands of dying patients, walked among the homeless, embraced AIDS victims when others recoiled. She broke barriers not with speeches, but with compassion. And now, in the moment when the people needed the royal family to return that same humanity, they got nothing. No shared mourning, no tears, only silence and a wall of royal indifference that felt higher than ever. The disconnect was staggering. Diana had bridged the gap between royalty and reality. She had brought warmth to an institution defined by frost. And now, with her gone, that warmth vanished, exposing the cold machinery beneath the crown. The people didn't just feel grief, they felt abandoned, betrayed by an institution that had already failed Diana once and now seemed to be failing her. Memory, too. The contrast between her love and their silence was impossible to ignore. But inside the storm, one voice was beginning to rise. A voice not bound by tradition or protocol. A voice that belonged not to a monarch, but to a brother. And while the palace stayed quiet, one man prepared to speak louder than the Queen ever could. In Westminster Abbey, the air was thick with sorrow. But it wasn't just the weight of grief that pressed down on the room, it was anticipation. Because the truth that had been suppressed for so long wasn't going to come from a royal. It wasn't going to come wrapped in polished words or coated in royal restraint. It came from Diana's brother. Charles Spencer stepped forward, not as a nobleman, not as a representative of the crown, but as a man who had just buried his sister, and he didn't hold back. What unfolded in those next few minutes would leave the monarchy shaken and the world stunned. His voice didn't tremble. It didn't crack under the weight of ceremony. Instead, it cut through the quiet like a blade. Spencer didn't speak of royal duties or titles. He spoke of betrayal, of abandonment, of a woman who had been left to navigate the cruelest parts of public life, without protection, not from the press, and not from the very family who should have guarded her with everything they had. He painted a portrait of Diana that was raw and real. A woman who gave endlessly, yet received so little in return from those who stood behind palace walls. And then, he went further. He looked out at the sea of faces, the royals among them, and made a promise. Her sons, William and Harry, would be protected, not by duty or protocol, but by family, by love. He declared that her blood relatives, not the crown, would ensure that her legacy lived on through her children. It was a direct challenge, a line drawn. In a place where tradition ruled and deference was expected, Charles Spencer had done the unthinkable. He broke the script. The royal family sat still, stone-faced and silent. The Queen didn't move. Prince Charles kept his gaze down. No one clapped. No one responded. But the people did. From the pews came something unheard of in royal funerals applause. Not polite, not restrained. Real, emotional, and unapologetic. It was the world saying what they couldn't say themselves. Thank you. Thank you for speaking the truth. Thank you for standing up when no one else would. In those few moments, Spencer gave a voice to the pain that millions had felt, but couldn't articulate. His speech became a rallying cry for everyone who had watched Diana be devoured by the very system meant to protect her. It wasn't just a eulogy, it was a reckoning. And it echoed far beyond the cathedral's stone walls. People didn't remember that day for the official prayers or hymns. They remembered Charles Spencer, the brother who dared to speak in a place built on silence. The man who challenged the monarchy on its own turf and lived to see the crowd rise with him. But courage always comes with a cost, and as Spencer would soon learn, some promises are harder to keep than they seem. But Spencer's promise came with a heavy price, and one he couldn't fully keep. He said he'd protect them. He made that vow in front of the entire world, with every camera watching and every grieving heart listening. But royalty doesn't let go that easily. Charles Spencer's words rang like thunder through Westminster Abbey. He would make sure William and Harry were cared for, loved and raised far from the cold grip that had failed their mother. Yet even as he spoke them, deep down, he must have known the battle was already lost. Because those boys weren't just sons. They were heirs, symbols of the crown. And the institution that had silenced Diana wasn't about to release its grip on her children. In the years that followed, Spencer would reflect with painful honesty. He admitted it, he couldn't keep the promise. He had no power to remove William and Harry from the royal machine. They were still inside it, bound by tradition, by duty, by bloodlines stretching back centuries. The throne wasn't just a seat, it was a cage. And though Spencer had tried to wrench the bars open with his words, the reality was brutal. The princes stayed where they were placed, walking the same gilded halls that had once ignored their mother's cries. The weight of that truth never left him, that he had stood up, boldly and defiantly, and still couldn't change the ending. The guilt lingered like a shadow. But Spencer didn't disappear. He couldn't. Instead, he became Diana's voice in the years that followed. In interviews, in memoirs, in quiet moments of remembrance, he returned again and again to her story, not the royal version, not the polished biography. The truth, her pain, her compassion, her struggle, her spirit. He fought to preserve the Diana the world, had loved the woman who held the sick, who hugged the ignored, who dared to challenge a system with nothing but kindness. He knew the palace would never tell that version, so he told it himself. And in doing so, he kept her alive not as a statue or a headline, but as a mother, a sister, a rebel, and a beacon of humanity. Spencer didn't need a crown to do what the royals wouldn't. He made sure Diana remained the people's princess, not the monarchy's property. But no matter how many times he spoke, no matter how many tributes he wrote, that one unfulfilled promise never stopped echoing in the back of his mind. Years passed, memories faded, but the wound stayed open. And then, against every expectation, something happened that no one, perhaps not even Spencer, saw coming. Because one of Diana's sons decided to do what even his uncle couldn't. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't seek approval. He simply walked away. He saw it happening all over again. The flashing cameras, the cruel headlines, the silence from inside the palace walls. For Prince Harry, the past wasn't a memory, it was a wound that never healed. And as he watched Meghan Markle become the latest target of the same brutal machinery that destroyed his mother, he made a decision that would shake the royal family to its core. This time, he refused to stay silent. Because the cost of silence, he knew too well, was a life. And he wasn't about to bury another woman he loved. From the very beginning, Harry had grown up in a shadow. Not the comforting kind. A cold one, cast by grief, trauma, and the weight of an institution that demanded obedience before emotion. He was just a boy when Diana died, but the scars didn't fade. Every headline about him, every photo snapped without permission, every reminder that he was both watched and trapped. He knew what the press could do. He had seen how it hunted. And when Meghan came into his life, radiant and unprepared, it didn't take long before history began repeating itself. At first, the headlines were charming, the love story, the fairy tale wedding. But then, the tone shifted. The press turned, slowly, then viciously. Everything Meghan did was twisted: her words, her expressions, her decisions. Rumors spread like wildfire, lies printed as facts, anonymous sources painting her as difficult, ungrateful, manipulative. And the palace? It did what it always had. Nothing, no defense, no public support, just silence, cold, familiar, and deafening. Harry watched it unravel in front of him. The woman he loved, once vibrant and hopeful, began to fade. The weight of it, the cruelty, the isolation, the betrayal pushed her into darkness. And Harry, seeing the signs he knew too well, couldn't ignore the echo of his past. Diana had tried to leave. She had begged for protection, but no one saved her. Now it was happening again. Only this time, he could act. In 2020, Prince Harry did what no modern senior royal had dared to do. He walked away. He and Meghan stepped back from their royal duties. They left the titles, the palaces, the protocols behind. The world gasped. Headlines screamed. Was this rebellion? Was it betrayal? But to Harry, it was something far deeper. It was love. It was survival. And more than anything, it was a tribute. A tribute to a mother who had once dreamed of the same freedom, who had tried to shield her sons from the very fire that eventually consumed her. Their departure wasn't a decision made lightly. It wasn't dramatic or impulsive. It was calculated, painful, and absolutely necessary. Because Harry had already lost one woman to the crown's silence, he wasn't about to lose another. And though he faced backlash, though his motives were questioned, his resolve didn't break. He knew why he had to do it. He had to end the cycle. And behind this bold move, many believe, stood the quiet support of a familiar figure, Uncle Charles. It wasn't just about her memory, it was about her mission. From the moment Diana walked into the royal spotlight, she began reshaping what it meant to wear a crown. She didn't rule from a throne. She touched hearts from hospital bedsides, refugee camps, and crowded alleyways. She shattered barriers with a single hug, tore down stigma with a simple gesture, and reminded the world that compassion was not weakness, it was power. And even after her death, that light refused to dim. Because one man, her brother, vowed it never would. Charles Spencer didn't vanish into aristocratic silence after the funeral. He didn't let the eulogy be the final word. Instead, he carried the torch Diana left behind, even when the palace tried to bury her legacy beneath layers of royal protocol. He gave interviews that cut through the noise. He spoke at memorials, not to celebrate a title, but to honor a soul. In documentaries and articles, he painted the full picture of a woman who had been brave, vulnerable, warm, and human. Not just a figure in history, but a force of nature that still shaped the world. And that world listened, because Diana's image became more than a royal fairy tale. She became a symbol of compassion, of courage, of truth spoken softly, yet boldly. The crown may have remained untouched by grief, but the public crowned her in a way that mattered more, as the people's princess. And that title, unpolished and unofficial, has outlived the stiffness of Buckingham Palace. It lives on in every kind word spoken in her name, in every cause her sons now carry forward. Prince William, grounded and dutiful, has honored his mother through charity and quiet empathy, walking the line between tradition and tenderness. Prince Harry, bold and outspoken, has used his platform to challenge systems and protect the vulnerable, echoing the risks Diana once took. In their own ways, they've both made sure the world doesn't forget the woman who raised them to care before they ruled. And behind them, still standing firm, is Charles Spencer, the brother who couldn't save her, but never stopped speaking for her. Through every tribute, every truth told, every wall of silence he dared to breach, he's kept Diana alive, not in marble, but in meaning. His loyalty didn't end at the Ijizu grave. It became a legacy of its own. But even after years of resilience, there was one moment that proved just how deep Spencer's pain still runs. One final confession that left the world stunned. Years of silence ended with one sentence that changed everything we thought we knew. Charles Spencer, the man who once stood at a royal funeral and tore through centuries of tradition with his grief-stricken truth, spoke again. But this time, he didn't just reflect, he revealed. In a recent interview that rippled through the press and shook the foundation of royal history, Spencer did what no royal figure dared. He peeled back the final layers of secrecy surrounding his sister's death. And what he said has left the world stunned, once again questioning everything we thought we'd buried. He didn't hesitate. He didn't soften his words. Spencer reaffirmed what he'd always believed, that Diana had been mistreated, not just in life, but in the way she was mourned. But now, his words carried a darker weight. For the first time publicly, he hinted that her death may not have been an accident at all. He didn't call it murder. He didn't offer wild conspiracy. But what he did say was chilling enough. I've always felt there are questions that were never fully answered. And that's something I carry every single day. It wasn't just about the crash. It was about everything leading up to it. The relentless chase, the lack of protection, the cold refusal from those who could have stepped in. Spencer spoke with visible pain, recalling how his efforts to shield Diana from the press had failed, and how, in the days after her death, he was powerless once again this time, forced to watch her sons parade through grief before a global audience, a decision he regrets deeply. I should have done more, he admitted. I'll never forgive myself for letting that happen. But he didn't stop there. Spencer turned his attention toward the palace, toward the silence that screamed in those early days of mourning. He called out the coldness, the distance, the strategic avoidance of emotion that defined the monarchy's response. And then he said what many had suspected but few ever dared voice. There are people still walking those palace halls who he believes should carry shame. Because they didn't just fail Diana. They failed her sons. They failed the people who loved her. Spencer's words weren't spoken in bitterness. They were laced with sorrow, but also with fire. He made it clear that Diana's legacy should never be filtered through royal protocol or sanitized by official biographies. Her story, he said, lives in raw truth in the hands of those brave enough to speak when silence is expected, in the faces of her children, in the causes she championed, in every person who still whispers her name like a prayer. And that, perhaps, is the final legacy Charles Spencer gives to the world. Not closure, not comfort, but a demand that we keep asking, the might-be questions the crown hoped would be forgotten. Because what he revealed didn't just honor his sister, it reopened wounds, exposed truths, and shattered the illusion of royal perfection. The monarchy hoped time would bury the pain. But now, the silence is broken. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments section, and we will see you in the next one.